October 1957. A metallic pulse echoed across the planet. Sputnik 1 had entered orbit. For the first time in human history, an object built by man circled the Earth. But the satellite itself wasn't what terrified Washington. 3 days later, the Soviet Union detonated a multi-megaton nuclear weapon. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether the Soviets could launch satellites, but what else they could deliver. Space was no longer the final frontier. It had become the highest ground of the Cold War. Behind this new battlefield stood two men. Wernher von Braun was a former German engineer who had surrendered to the Americans at the end of the Second World War. Sergei Korolev was a Soviet visionary who had survived the Great Purge, prison camps, and near execution. Separated by the Iron Curtain and united by an obsession, both dreamed of reaching the stars while their governments saw space as the ultimate proving ground in the struggle for global supremacy. Their struggle would become the greatest technological contest of the 20th century. This is their story. The space race thriller.
I did it all, I played pretend, I moved the mountains to be your friend. I wanna know if it mattered.
8 years before Sputnik transformed the Cold War, another rocket had already changed history. It wasn't built to explore space. It was built to win a war. The V-2 rocket was the first human-made object to reach the edge of space, and the first ballistic missile ever used in combat. It would become the technological foundation upon which both superpowers built their space programs. It was the weapon that defied warning. For the citizens of London, the V-2 was not an aircraft. It was a bolt of lightning from the heavens. Traveling faster than the speed of sound, there was no engine whine to give warning, and no air raid siren fast enough to alert civilians. The rocket simply arrived, a silent, supersonic death. The V-2 was born on a remote stretch of Germany's Baltic coast at the secret Peenemünde Research Center. By 1944, as the Third Reich began its inevitable collapse, these missiles became Hitler's final, desperate gamble. A fleet of vengeance weapons, designed to shatter British resolve and stall the Allied advance through sheer, terrifying innovation. The V-2 was the crown jewel of Hitler's Wunderwaffe, the so-called miracle weapons program. It was a project born not of strategic military necessity, but of a dying regime's desperate attempt to claw back victory from the jaws of defeat. While the Soviets closed in on Berlin and the Western Allies broke through Germany's defenses, the Nazi leadership poured its remaining resources into the bunkers of Peenemünde. They hoped to force a negotiated peace through terror, but the scientists behind the rocket knew the truth. Their creation was a glimpse of the future, being wasted in the final, frantic gasps of a lost war. By late April 1945, Germany had descended into chaos. The war had become a frantic race against time. As Soviet forces thundered toward the Baltic coast, American and British forces pushed eastward toward Peenemünde. Whoever captured the research center would inherit the future of rocketry. The prize wasn't territory, it was knowledge. Deep inside, Peenemünde sat the greatest concentration of rocket engineers the world had ever seen, along with years of research, designs, test data, and manufacturing expertise that neither the Americans nor the Soviets could afford to lose. Hitler's final order was simple: silence. SS units were instructed to execute the scientists who held the secrets of the V-2 before they could fall into enemy hands. When Wernher von Braun learned of Hitler's orders, he knew the Third Reich was finished. He chose his side, not out of ideology, but out of survival. Gathering his closest team, he organized a desperate convoy through the collapsing German front lines and surrendered to the Americans. He wasn't just saving himself. He was carrying the future of modern rocketry into American hands. The U.S. High Command knew exactly who von Braun was. He became the crown jewel of Operation Paperclip, the American mission to capture Germany's greatest scientists and engineers. A man who had designed weapons of terror now held the keys to humanity's future in space. The race to the wreckage was over. The race for the future had just begun. But before he became America's most valuable engineer, before he became an architect of war, he was simply a boy staring at the moon, wondering if a machine could ever leave the Earth behind. For Wernher von Braun, the road to the moon didn't start in a government facility. It started with a book, inspired by the radical theories presented by Hermann Oberth in his book, The Rocket into Planetary Space. A young von Braun transformed from a distracted student to a young man who applied himself to math and physics. By 1934, he had earned his Ph.D., but his true work remained in the shadows. His actual thesis, construction, theoretical, and experimental solution to the problem of the liquid propellant rocket, was so advanced and so potentially dangerous that the German army classified it for decades. The work was not seen as a scientist pursuing exploration. The army saw it as a man building the future of long-range warfare. Von Braun invented the discipline of measuring rockets. He pioneered a modern rocket firing stand, developing innovative sensors to map the volatile, high-pressure environment of the combustion chamber. He obsessed over the fluid dynamics of ethanol, testing how it mixed with liquid oxygen to produce a stable, sustained, and steerable thrust. His data collection was unprecedented. He turned the black art of rocket science into a repeatable, predictable industrial process. His work culminated in the design and test-bench firing of the A-1 and A-2 rockets. By analyzing the data from these successful flights, reaching altitudes of up to 3.5 kilometers, von Braun refined his mathematical models, correcting for aerodynamic drag and center of gravity shifts. This was the juice of his genius. The realization that the A-series wasn't a static machine, but an evolving mathematical sequence. These early A-series designs were the primordial cells of the space age. Von Braun expanded his design to include the A9 and A10, massive multi-stage concepts that would one day form the literal foundation of the American space program. He had mathematically proven that the path to the stars was not a dream, but a calculated ascent. Von Braun knew that to achieve his dream, he needed power. He hitched his ambition to the Nazi war machine, where he developed the A4, infamously known as the V2 rocket, which would become the first man-made object to breach the Earth's atmosphere. But von Braun saw beyond the weapon. He convinced himself he was building a space program, even as his creations were being engineered to rain destruction on London. He was trading his moral compass for the only engine capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere. Von Braun's era had reached its violent conclusion. His engineers were scattered, his secrets buried in the German mud. But the science didn't die, it was harvested. While the Americans secured the man, the Soviets began a brutal, systematic salvage. Under the banner of Operation Osoaviakim, Sergei Korolev was sent into the scorched remains of the Reich. He was a survivor of Stalin's labor camps, tasked with hunting down the ghosts of the German program. He didn't just want the blueprints, he wanted to understand how a nation could master the heavens. This was the beginning of Korolev's life work, and his journey would be far more harrowing than anything von Braun had ever known. Sergei Korolev was born of a different fire. Trained as an aircraft engineer under Andrei Tupolev, Korolev found his true calling in rocketry. Along with space enthusiast Friedrich Zander, he co-founded GERD, the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion. It was here, in the frost of 1933, that they launched the GERD-X, the Soviet Union's first liquid-fueled rocket. But in the USSR, ambition was a liability. The Great Purge didn't just dismantle the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, it consumed its architects. Glushko, Langemak, the best minds in Soviet rocketry, were dragged into the dark. In 1938, it was Korolev's turn. Based on the broken, forced confessions of his own colleagues, he was sent to the Gulag. For 6 years, the man who dreamed of the stars fought to survive the mud. Scurvy took his teeth. The cold nearly took his heart. He was a ghost in the system until his old mentor, Tupolev, pulled strings from inside his own prison cell. Korolev was moved to a Sharashka, a top-secret prison lab. Here, working under Tupolev, Korolev contributed to bomber aircraft development, while proving his value to the Soviet state. August 1945. The war in the Pacific didn't just end, it was vaporized. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, turning industrial hubs into radioactive graveyards in a matter of seconds. Within days, Japan surrendered, but the shockwave didn't stop in Tokyo. It raced halfway across the globe, landing squarely in the offices of the Kremlin. When Stalin heard of the atomic weapon, he became obsessed. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant theoretical physicist working within the Manhattan Project, was secretly funneling the crown jewels of atomic research directly to Moscow. Stalin's orders were chillingly precise. He did not just want to replicate the American bomb. He demanded a delivery system that could carry that horror to the very doorstep of the American homeland. The Soviet nuclear project became the single most urgent mandate. Sergei Korolev became the engineer tasked with transforming captured German rocketry into Stalin's delivery system for the ultimate weapon. By 1945, Korolev, the prisoner, had become a colonel, tasked with hunting the remnants of von Braun's rocket in the Peenemünde Army Research Center. He knew the prize wasn't just the metallic remnants, it was the math, the combustion data, the guidance systems, the hundreds of thousands of engineering man-hours hidden inside a weapon that had once terrorized London. Operation Osoavi Achim. In a single night in October 1946, the Soviets forcibly relocated a brain trust of over 2,000 German rocketry scientists to the USSR. The scientists were loaded onto trains, heading east into the unknown. While Wernher von Braun chose to surrender to the Americans, some of his closest colleagues decided otherwise, most notably Helmut Grootrup. As the lead guidance systems engineer, he was arguably the most important V2 engineer after von Braun. Grootrup was tethered by the reality of his family. He viewed the American offer with profound skepticism, fearing he would become a political pawn in a foreign land. Choosing his family's stability over an uncertain life in the United States, Grootrup made the decision to remain in the Soviet-occupied zone after the war. This single personal choice split the V2 legacy in two. Grootrup would become the shadow architect of the early Soviet program, playing an essential role in helping Korolev reverse engineer the V2. As World War II came to a conclusion, paranoia defined the Soviet state. Fearing espionage, sabotage, and assassination, the Soviet state erased Korolev's identity. To his own team, to his own government, and to the world, he was never Sergei Korolev. He was simply the chief designer.
Sinking in, I know this feels right.
The Soviet effort to reverse engineer the V2 was slow, painful, and defined by mistrust. The German team, led by Helmut Grootrup, held the secrets of the V2's propulsion and guidance systems, but the language barrier and an atmosphere of total suspicion made progress agonizing. The Germans weren't simply transferring blueprints, they were transferring an entire engineering culture, one painful lesson at a time. Korolev had to play a dangerous game, extracting every scrap of technical knowledge while ensuring his own engineers learned enough to eventually stand on their own. August 29, 1949. The American nuclear monopoly was shattered. In a remote testing facility in Kazakhstan, the USSR detonated its first nuclear device, codename RD-S1. The shockwave reached all the way to Washington, ending the era of American untouchability. The following year, the Soviets proved the nuclear bomb was no longer a theoretical weapon. They launched the R2. This was the first major leap beyond the V2. Its range was double that of its German predecessor, stretching to 600 kilometers, and it featured a revolutionary separated warhead, allowing the payload to re-enter the atmosphere independently of the rocket body. It was a clear, lethal signal. The Soviets were no longer just reverse engineering the past. They were aggressively engineering the future of long-range destruction. Across the ocean, Wernher von Braun faced a different kind of pressure. The US rocket program was bogged down in bureaucratic gridlock and public failure. Wernher von Braun realized he couldn't win on hardware alone. He had to win the imagination of the American people. He made a gamble that no military commander would dare. He went to Hollywood. Partnering with Walt Disney, von Braun bypassed the bureaucratic censors and took his vision for human spaceflight directly into the living rooms of millions. The Disney specials were a masterclass in soft power. With breathtaking animation and von Braun's infectious scientific optimism, he turned abstract engineering into a national dream. Overnight, the rocket went from being a terrifying instrument of war to a symbol of human destiny. It was a staggering success. The specials transformed public opinion and helped create a political climate increasingly receptive to investment in space exploration. Von Braun had successfully commodified the future, ensuring that when the time for the moon landing came, the American people wouldn't just be watching, they would be demanding it. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Eisenhower administration codified a terrifying new reality: massive retaliation. Championed by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, this military doctrine threatened an overwhelming nuclear strike in response to any Soviet aggression. The United States relied on a ring of Allied air bases stretching across Europe and Asia, placing nuclear bombers within reach of the Soviet heartland. But as the Soviets struggled to perfect their long-range delivery systems, they were driven by a singular, desperate mandate: to close the gap before the Americans could strike first. Behind the grand speeches and the military doctrine, the space race was being won and lost in the test pits. It was a fight against the very laws of combustion. Two men emerged as the essential, if erratic, engines of their respective programs: Jack Parsons in America and Valentin Glushko in the Soviet Union. The path to the moon was paved with obsession. In the California desert, Jack Parsons was conducting experiments that looked less like science and more like a fever dream. Parsons was a brilliant self-taught chemist, but his mind was occupied by a terrifying duality. He was as consumed by Aleister Crowley's occultism as he was by rocketry. For Parsons, the boundary between the physical and the supernatural was thin. Away from the laboratory, Parsons immersed himself in elaborate occult rituals, invoking the god Pan and pursuing Aleister Crowley's vision of transcending ordinary human limits. To his colleagues, it was madness. To Parsons, it was the necessary invocation of forces that would allow humanity to break the shackles of Earth. But beneath the occult rituals lay a breakthrough that changed spaceflight forever. Parsons mastered the creation of castable composite solid propellant. Unlike the mechanically complex and difficult-to-handle liquid engines of the era, Parsons' fuel was stable, reliable, and, most crucially, could be stored for months inside its casing. This became a crucial building block for heavy-lift rocketry. His solid fuel didn't require the complex pumps and plumbing of liquid engines. It provided the instant, high-thrust kick needed for first-stage boosters. Parsons' dangerous, unconventional chemistry enabled the enormous lift required to leave Earth. Parsons was the American enabler, but he was also a liability the government would eventually cast aside. Across the globe, Glushko was his Soviet mirror, a cold, calculating engineer whose mastery of liquid propulsion became the backbone of Korolev's program. Glushko's genius lay in the brutal efficiency of his liquid-fueled engines. He pioneered regenerative cooling, where the rocket's own propellant was circulated around the combustion chamber to prevent it from melting under extreme temperatures. His work on high-pressure turbopumps, the heart of every liquid rocket engine, allowed enormous quantities of propellant to reach the combustion chamber without relying on impractically heavy pressure-fed systems. Glushko led the development of the engines that powered the Soviet space program. Yet his bitter rivalry with the chief designer, fueled by years of personal bitterness and irreconcilable engineering philosophies, threatened to tear the Soviet program apart from within. They were the architects of the volatile force that would carry the first humans into the void. By the mid-1950s, Sergei Korolev understood a simple truth. Rockets built for peace would never be funded. Rockets built for war would. He sold the R-7 not as a path to the stars, but as the ultimate weapon, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of delivering a multi-megaton nuclear warhead across continents. The military believed it was buying a deterrent. Korolev knew he was secretly building humanity's first bridge to space. That bridge was unlike anything ever attempted. The R-7 was the largest and most mechanically ambitious rocket yet constructed. A central core was surrounded by 4 strap-on boosters, all 5 engines igniting together at launch. Every valve, every turbopump, and every separation charge had to perform with near-perfect synchronization. A single mistimed event could tear the entire vehicle apart before it ever reached orbit. The Soviet Union wasn't simply building a bigger rocket. It was attempting to orchestrate the most complex machine humanity had ever assembled. As the R-7 approached flight readiness, Korolev realized he faced a different problem. The Americans were preparing to launch an advanced scientific satellite during the International Geophysical Year. Matching their payload would take time he didn't have. So, Korolev made one of the most brilliant engineering decisions of the space race. He removed almost everything. No elaborate scientific instruments, no sophisticated experiments, only a polished aluminum sphere containing a radio transmitter, batteries, thermal control systems, and a simple radio beacon. If he could not build the smartest satellite, he would build the first. On October 4th, 1957, that decision changed history. Sputnik 1 reached orbit. Its steady beep was heard around the world. To the public, it was merely a radio signal. To military planners in Washington, it was proof that the Soviet Union now possessed a rocket powerful enough to deliver a nuclear weapon almost anywhere on Earth. The implications were terrifying. The doctrine of massive retaliation suddenly looked far less certain. America was no longer beyond reach. 1 month later, Korolev pressed the advantage. Sputnik 2 carried Laika into orbit, the first living creature to circle the Earth. It was an extraordinary engineering achievement and a profound ethical tragedy. The spacecraft was never designed to return. Laika died only hours after launch when overheating and stress overwhelmed the capsule. Meanwhile, America's answer was unraveling before the world's eyes. The Vanguard rocket was intended to restore national confidence. Instead, it rose only a few feet above the launch pad before exploding live on television. The humiliation was immediate. The world watched as the nation that had invented the atomic bomb appeared incapable of placing a grapefruit-sized satellite into orbit. Yet, failure became the catalyst for reinvention. Explorer 1, launched just weeks later under Wernher von Braun's team, succeeded where Vanguard had failed. Unlike Sputnik's deliberately simple design, Explorer 1 carried sophisticated scientific instruments built by James Van Allen. Its discovery of the intense radiation belts surrounding Earth transformed the mission from a political response into a genuine scientific breakthrough. The race was no longer about placing machines into orbit. It was about placing people there. Both superpowers turned to biology. Dogs, monkeys, mice. Each launch answered a single question. Could life survive the violence of spaceflight? Many of those pioneers never returned. They died in explosions, parachute failures, and the unforgiving environment beyond the atmosphere. Their sacrifice quietly solved the biological problems that rockets alone never could. By the end of the decade, the engineering challenge was no longer reaching space. It was bringing a human home alive. The shock of Sputnik forced America to stop reacting and start institutionalizing. In July 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA. It was a decisive pivot, a civilian agency that openly pursued exploration while quietly serving America's strategic competition with the Soviet Union. For Wernher von Braun, however, this new era brought an unexpected paradox. At last, he had the resources he had dreamed of, but he was constrained by a culture that demanded proof before prestige. He was building a masterpiece, but he was losing the race to a gambler who was willing to bet everything on the next launch. For the United States, 1959 became a year of bitter seconds. The Soviets launched Luna 2, the first human-made object to strike the moon. Then came Luna 3, returning the first photographs of the moon's far side, a landscape no human eye had ever witnessed. Every Soviet triumph was another reminder that, despite America's industrial might, it remained one step behind a man who had survived the Gulag. The race had become a contest between two engineering philosophies. Von Braun was the cautious architect. He believed every system should be proven before a human life depended upon it. In January 1961, he insisted on flying Ham the chimpanzee before Alan Shepard. accepting that America might lose the title of first human in space if it meant protecting his astronaut. He was building a staircase to the stars that would endure. Korolev, meanwhile, was the desperate gambler. He accepted narrower engineering margins, not because he lacked technical ability, but because he understood the brutal arithmetic of the Cold War. As former Soviet engineer Boris Chertok later reflected, they lived by daring, not recklessness. Every kilogram removed, every test skipped, every deadline shortened increased the risk, but it also increased the chance of victory. Within the Soviet design bureaus, another conflict was unfolding. Korolev and Mikhail Yangel clashed over the future of Soviet rocketry. Korolev championed cryogenic propellants, such as liquid oxygen, believing they offered the greatest long-term performance for spaceflight. Yangel argued for storable hypergolic propellants that could remain fueled inside a missile for months, ready to launch at a moment's notice. It was a debate between performance and readiness, space exploration or military practicality. Then came catastrophe. On October 24, 1960, during preparations for Yangel's R-16 missile, pressure to meet an impossible political deadline overrode basic safety procedures. A premature engine ignition triggered an inferno on the launch pad. More than 100 engineers, technicians, and military personnel were killed. The Soviet Union erased the disaster from history. Officially, it had never happened. Unofficially, it became one of the deadliest accidents in the history of rocketry. Korolev himself escaped only because he had stepped away moments earlier. The lesson was unmistakable. In the race to conquer space, engineering shortcuts could become death sentences. By early 1961, the pressure had reached its breaking point. Von Braun demanded one final unmanned Mercury Redstone test before allowing Alan Shepard to fly. The mission, Mercury Redstone B-D, launched successfully on March 24, 1961. The decision delayed America's first human spaceflight. It also made it safer. Across the Iron Curtain, Korolev recognized the opportunity immediately. He chose Yuri Gagarin, young, calm under pressure, small enough to fit comfortably inside the cramped Vostok capsule. April 12, 1961. With a single historic shout of "Poyakali, let's go," Gagarin shattered the final frontier. He became the first human to look down at the Earth from the void. In an instant, the Soviet Union transformed in the eyes of the world from a closed, mysterious empire into the undisputed technological juggernaut of the century. Across the globe, Gagarin was heralded not just as a pilot, but as the pioneer of a new, socialist future for all of humanity. Korolev had achieved total victory, casting his nation as the inevitable architects of the next stage of human civilization. The Soviet era reached its mark. The race appeared won. But as the world celebrated the first man in space, the architect of the American future turned back to his drafting board. The race to orbit was over. The race to the moon had only just begun.
I did it all, I played pretend. I moved the mountains to be your friend. I wanna know if it mattered.